We need you out by the end of the month, Arthur. This is our house, not a retirement home. My daughter-in-law's voice carried through the kitchen wall, sharp and final, the way she'd probably always wanted to say it. My son said nothing to stop her. I stood in the hallway holding a glass of water I no longer wanted, listening to 32 years of fatherhood being dismissed in one sentence. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and write in the comments what time it is where you are right now. The drive home from Houston Methodist had taken 40 minutes in afternoon traffic, long enough to replay what Dr. Okafor had told me. Moderate aortic stenosis, manageable with medication and monitoring. Not a death sentence by any reasonable measure, but the kind of news that changes how you think about your remaining years and the people you want to spend them with. I'd been living with my son Daniel and his wife Karen for 2 years. After my wife Patricia passed, the house in River Oaks felt enormous in ways that had nothing to do with square footage. Daniel had called me 2 weeks after the funeral. "Dad, come stay with us. We have the guest suite. The kids would love having you close." Karen had stood beside him on FaceTime, nodding, her smile reaching her eyes in a way it would stop doing within about 8 months of my actual arrival. I was 64 years old. I had recently sold Walker Orthopedic Associates, the practice I'd spent 26 years building from a single exam room in Katy to a 12-physician group across 4 Houston locations. The buyer, a private equity firm out of Atlanta, had paid me well. Very well. But Daniel and Karen believed I'd sold under duress after Patricia's death, that grief had made me accept whatever was offered. They believed I was living with them because I needed the financial shelter. That belief was the foundation of everything that followed. I kept my actual financial situation in a private banking relationship at a branch they had no reason to visit, with a private banker named Howard Gill who'd managed my investments for 17 years. The statements went to a P.O. box I'd maintained since before the sale. When I moved into Daniel's guest suite, I brought 1 suitcase, a box of books, and a folder of what appeared to be modest retirement documents. I left the real paperwork exactly where it belonged. Every month I gave Daniel $3,500 in cash. My contribution to household expenses, I called it. He accepted it with a brief thanks and a hand that barely paused on its way to his wallet. Karen accepted it by not mentioning it, which was her particular brand of gratitude. My granddaughter Sophie was 9 when I moved in. My grandson Miles was 6. They were the honest ones in that house. Sophie would save me the crossword from the Sunday paper. Miles would drag me outside to watch him throw a baseball, even though his form needed significant work. I spent 2 years quietly correcting his grip while pretending to simply be watching. The test started on the day I arrived. I didn't announce it as a test. I simply paid attention. What I observed over 24 months was this. Karen resented my presence in the way that people resent something they cannot directly complain about. She was precise about it. She never said anything directly cruel to my face. The cruelty lived in other places. In the way she spoke about my dietary restrictions to her friends as though they were an imposition on her kitchen. In the way she redirected family conversations away from anything that required my input. In the way she smiled at Daniel across the dinner table whenever I mentioned Patricia, a private smile that said something I could never quite prove. Daniel had grown into a man shaped almost entirely by the path of least resistance. He worked in commercial real estate, did reasonably well, spent accordingly. He loved his children and was pleasant to me, and had somewhere along the way decided that keeping Karen happy was the same thing as keeping his family intact. I understood the math he was doing. I simply disagreed with it. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday. I sat across from Dr. Okafor in that beige office and listened to the technical explanation, asked the appropriate questions, and drove home carrying the manila folder on the passenger seat. When I walked through Daniel's front door, Karen was standing in the kitchen, arranging flowers that had just been delivered. She looked at the medical folder, the way you look at something you expected. We sat down to dinner. I told them at the table. Aortic stenosis. Manageable. Doctor. Okafor was confident about the treatment timeline. Karen said that must be frightening. Then she asked Daniel if he'd spoken to their accountant about the quarterly filing. The subject changed before I'd finished my water glass. Daniel reached over and patted my arm once. He said to let him know if I needed anything. His eyes were already moving back to his plate. I excused myself after dessert, thanked Karen for the meal, and walked down the hall to the guest suite. I sat on the edge of my bed in the dark for a while. Not because I was devastated, because I was documenting. I was noting, with the same clinical attention I'd applied to patient charts for 3 decades, exactly what I was dealing with. That night, the walls did their work. I wasn't trying to listen. Their bedroom was down the hall, and the house had the particular acoustic flaw of older construction, where sound traveled in ways the architect never intended. I heard Karen's voice first, precise and elevated, the way it got when she'd been thinking about something all day and had finally decided to say it. She said my health situation changed things. She said she hadn't signed up to manage an elderly sick person in her home. She used the word liability. She used the phrase end-of-life planning. She said Daniel needed to have a real conversation with me about what came next, and that what came next could not be their guest suite. Daniel's voice was lower, harder to make out. I caught the words dad and difficult and not fair. Karen cut through all of it. She said I was 64 with a heart condition and it would only get harder. She said the children were at an age where they didn't need that kind of stress in the house. She said if Daniel actually respected her, he would handle it. She said the guest suite was supposed to be temporary and 2 years was not temporary. Then she said the sentence I would remember precisely. She said, I am telling you right now, Daniel, I want your father out of this house before the end of the month. He can afford a senior living facility. That's what they're there for. I stepped back from my door. I walked to the window. Houston at night, all that flat orange glow. In the morning, Daniel was in the kitchen before me. He poured coffee with the concentration of someone who had practiced their opening line and was not confident about delivery. He said he'd been thinking, and that maybe it would be good for me, for my health actually, to have my own space. Less stress, more independence. He said he'd looked into some really nice assisted living communities near the medical center. He said he'd help me with the search. I looked at my son for a long moment. I thought about the day he was born, the way Patricia had cried, the way I had pretended not to. I thought about his college graduation and the summer he'd spent interning at a firm downtown that I'd called in a favor to arrange. I thought about the down payment Karen had asked for help with 6 years ago and how I'd written that check without asking for anything in return, or so they thought. I said, I understand completely, Daniel. I'll start making arrangements today. He looked up from his coffee mug, surprised in the way people are when they expect resistance and get none. That afternoon, while Daniel was at work and Karen was at her Pilates class, I called Howard Gill. Howard picked up on the second ring. He'd been my private banker long enough to understand that when I called without a specific question, I was about to make a significant move. I told him I needed $800,000 accessible in my primary checking account within a week. He asked if I was buying something interesting. I told him I was buying my life back. He didn't ask for elaboration. That was why I'd stayed with him for 17 years. Then I called a real estate attorney named Diane Vasquez, who'd helped me with the practice sale and knew my financial situation in full. I told her I needed to move quickly on a property purchase, cash transaction. I wanted to be out of my current living situation within 30 days. She asked how much I was working with. I told her to pull up listings in the Memorial area and the Heights. Budget of $700,000 to $800,000. Single family, private yard, at least a proper home office. She was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said she'd have a showing list ready by Thursday. I spent that evening in my guest suite, opening the portfolio app I kept on a separate phone Daniel and Karen had never seen. The balance read $9,412,000, plus the interest that compounded while I slept. The practice sale had closed at $7.2 million after taxes. Howard had invested conservatively, then not so conservatively when the market cooperated. Patricia had been proud of how careful I was with money. I'd tried to tell her once that careful wasn't the right word. Patient was the right word. I had been very patient. Thursday afternoon, I met Diane at a coffee shop in Montrose. She spread 7 listings across the table, 2 in Memorial, 3 in the Heights, 2 in Garden Oaks. I studied them the way I used to study imaging results, methodically, looking for what wasn't immediately obvious. One caught me immediately. Garden Oaks, white brick craftsman, built in 2018, 3 bedrooms and a proper library room with built-in shelving, private backyard. Quiet street with established trees, listed at $760,000. The sellers had relocated to Seattle for work and needed to close. I tapped the photo. When can we see it? Tomorrow morning, Diane said. I made an offer before I left the property. Full asking price. Cash. The sellers accepted within 4 hours. On the morning I left Daniel's house, I woke at 5:30. The guest suite was mostly packed. I'd been methodical about it. A box or two each evening after they'd gone to bed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that signaled departure. The moving company would arrive at 8. I had arranged it on a day Daniel had a client breakfast, and Karen took the children to school. On the kitchen table, I left an envelope containing that month's contribution. $3,500 in cash. The same as every month. Beside it, I placed a note I had written and rewritten 4 times across 3 evenings. The final version said, "Daniel, Karen, thank you for the use of the guest suite these 2 years. I've found my own place and will be moved out by noon. I appreciate your hospitality, and I especially appreciate the clarity your recent conversation provided. Don't worry about making arrangements for the elderly sick person. He's arranged things himself." "Dad," I read it once more. The phrase elderly sick person came directly from Karen's voice through the wall. Let her recognize her own words when she read them back. The movers were efficient. 2 men who handled everything with professional care and didn't ask why a man in his 60s was moving from a guest suite into an $800,000 home. I tipped them generously and watched the truck pull away from my new driveway at 11:45. I stood in my new entryway. High ceilings, natural light, a library room with walls waiting for books, space that belonged to no one but me. I made coffee in my own kitchen and sat at my own table and looked out my own window at my own backyard and understood, for the first time since Patricia died, what home felt like. Daniel texted at 2:17 that afternoon. "Got your note. Hope you're comfortable. Let us know if you need help with anything." 13 words. I read them 3 times. Then I set the phone face down on the counter and started unpacking my books. The calls began on the second day. 3 from Daniel, 1 from Karen, which told me something. Karen's pride usually kept her from direct outreach. The fact that she called meant Daniel had shown her the note and she had done the arithmetic. I let every call go to voicemail. On the 4th day, I sat in my new library and called Diane Vasquez. I told her it was time to discuss my estate planning. She asked when I wanted to come in. I said tomorrow, and I'd like my son Daniel Walker to receive a call from your office this week. I want him informed of certain things. There was a pause, then she said, "How much does he know?" I said, "He thinks I sold a struggling practice for whatever I could get. He thinks I'm living on what's left." Another pause. "Understood," she said. "I'll call him Thursday." Diane's office was on the 20th floor of a building downtown with views of Buffalo Bayou. I had arranged things carefully. The call to Daniel would come first. He would see the documents. Then we would see what happened next. Diane told me afterward that he arrived looking the way people look when they're pretending to be casual about something that terrifies them. He sat down, accepted coffee, made small talk about the traffic on 610. She slid the first document across her desk without preamble. Portfolio statement. My name at the top. The balance in standard print. Daniel looked at it for 4 seconds before his face changed. The professional composure he'd spent his career constructing simply stopped working. He said, "That's not possible." Diane explained that it was not only possible but current. She showed him the closing documents from the practice sale, $7.2 million, the investment records, the current account balances, the deed to the Garden Oaks property, purchased 11 days ago, cash transaction. Daniel sat motionless for what Diane estimated was nearly a full minute. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to something I recognized from when he was a teenager delivering bad news. He said, "He told me the sale barely covered the debts. He said he had to downsize." Diane said, "Your father sold Walker Orthopedic Associates for $7.2 million after taxes. He has invested that capital carefully over 5 years. He has never required financial assistance." Daniel asked about the $3,500 every month. Diane said, "Your father mentioned those contributions. His choice, not his necessity." She told me he sat with that information for a long time. "Processing," she said, like watching someone try to read in a language they almost know. Then she delivered the second thing I had asked her to tell him. She said, "Your father also wanted you to know that he is revising his estate planning. You were previously listed as sole beneficiary. That designation is under review. He'll contact you when he's ready to discuss the matter." Daniel left her office and sat in his car in the parking garage for 22 minutes. Diane's window overlooked the structure. She watched him. He didn't make a call. He just sat. Eventually, he drove away. The calls started immediately. 7 in the first 2 hours. Then texts. Daniel's were measured, careful. Karen's were not. She moved from confusion to apology to something sharper within a span of 3 messages. The fourth one said that I had deceived them, that I had allowed them to believe I was dependent when I wasn't, that this wasn't fair. I read that one twice. I found it instructive that the word fair appeared in a message from a woman who had told her husband to remove his elderly sick father from the house before the end of the month. I did not respond to it. What I did instead was call Howard Gill and ask him to pull up a specific document. 6 years ago, when Daniel and Karen had purchased their second home in West Houston, they'd come to me for help with the down payment. They needed $60,000. I'd written the check and told Daniel to sign the accompanying paperwork, which I called a formality for my accountant. Daniel had signed it without reading it because he trusted his father. He was correct to trust me. He was incorrect to not read the document. What he had signed was a promissory note for $60,000 at 4.5% annual interest over a 7-year term. Properly notarized. Filed correctly, Howard had kept the original. I had kept a copy in a file folder behind my winter coats in the guest suite closet for 2 years. The total amount owed, with 6 years of compounded interest, was $71,400. The acceleration clause allowed me to call the full balance due with 90 days' notice. I asked Diane to draft the demand letter. She asked if I was certain. I told her I wasn't interested in their destruction. I was interested in their education. There was a difference, and I needed to administer it precisely. The certified letter arrived on a Monday. Daniel signed for it, recognized Diane's firm in the return address, and opened it standing in his own entryway. Diane had written it without decoration. Principal, interest, total due, 90 days. The acceleration clause, referenced by section number, with the original promissory note attached. His signature was right there at the bottom, bold, confident, 6 years younger. Karen's reaction reached me through various channels over the following days. She drove past my Garden Oaks house twice in 1 week, slowing near the gate in a way the neighbors apparently noticed. She called her mother's attorney about contesting my will. The attorney told her that in Texas, a competent adult distributed their estate however they wished. Karen had left that consultation with significantly less hope than she'd arrived with. Their financial picture clarified quickly in the weeks that followed. The house in West Houston carried a mortgage they'd sized to 2 incomes. Daniel's commissions had been inconsistent lately. Karen's consulting work was part-time by choice. Their savings, when she sat down and actually calculated what $71,000 would require, represented essentially everything they had accessible. They tried 4 lenders. Each one found the existing lien on their property and declined the equity loan. One loan officer suggested they consider selling. Karen began listing things on Facebook Marketplace. Designer pieces she'd paid full retail for and described to her friends as investments. A home theater setup they'd spent $12,000 on 2 years ago, listed for $4,000. Jewelry I recognized from family dinners. The activity made me neither happy nor sad. It made me think of the word consequence. My phone rang on a Thursday evening. The number was Sophie's school iPad. Grandpa Arthur? My granddaughter's voice. 9 years old, and careful with her words in the way children are when they're carrying something they don't fully understand. Hey, sweetheart, how'd you get this number? Mom's contacts. She lets me use the iPad for homework. Sophie paused. Are you okay? Daddy seems really sad lately. And Mom keeps closing the office door when she's on the phone. I sat very still in my library. I'm okay, I told her. Are you okay? Kids at school keep asking about our house. Sophie's voice dropped. Emma Chen said her mom said something about us having to sell it. I closed my eyes. Collateral damage. The phrase that always arrives exactly when you don't want it to. Sophie, I said carefully, sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that take a while to fix. Your parents and I have some things to work through. None of it is about you or Miles. Did you leave because of something we did? No. I want you to hear me say that clearly. You and your brother are the best parts of everything. This is a grown-up situation and it will get resolved. After she hung up, I sat with the silence for a while. The library was warm. The books were arranged the way I liked them. Outside, the Garden Oaks neighborhood was doing what quiet streets do in the evening. I thought about the promissory note. I thought about Karen's message using the word fair. I thought about my son sitting in a parking garage for 22 minutes, unable to call his wife. I thought about Sophie asking if she'd done something wrong. Then I called Diane and told her I wanted to schedule a meeting, neutral location, all three of us. They arrived at the coffee shop in Montrose 12 minutes early. I watched from the parking lot as they took a corner table, ordered nothing, sat with their hands near each other on the table surface without quite touching. Karen had dressed carefully. Daniel looked like a man who hadn't been sleeping well. I walked in at exactly 3 o'clock, ordered coffee at the counter, carried it to their table, let the silence exist for a moment. Then I sat down. Daniel spoke first. He didn't lead with excuses. I had expected some architecture of rationalization, and he surprised me by skipping it entirely. He said, "You raised me to be someone better than I've been. You paid for everything. You showed up every time. And when you needed us to simply be present while you dealt with a diagnosis, Karen and I started calculating what you cost us. That's unforgivable, and I know it. I'm not here to defend it. I'm here to tell you I know what I did, and I'm sorry." He stopped. Looked at the table. Karen went next. Her voice had a different quality than usual. The precision was still there, but the edge behind it was gone, replaced by something that looked like it had been expensive to arrive at. She said, "I called you an elderly sick person who needed to be removed from my house. I said it to my husband through a wall, and I knew you might hear it, and part of me didn't care. That part of me is something I've been looking at very closely these past weeks. You were never a burden. You were the person holding that family together, and I spent 2 years resenting you for it." She paused. She said, "I'm sorry, Arthur. Not because of the money, because of what I actually did." I drank my coffee. Let the quiet work. Then I said, "I need you to answer one question honestly. Are you apologizing because of the promissory note, or because what you did was wrong?" The silence that followed was the kind that means the person is choosing between the answer that sounds correct and the answer that is true. Karen answered first. She said, "Both. I wish I could tell you it's only the second reason. Losing the money made us understand what we actually lost. That makes us exactly the kind of people you thought we were." I looked at my son. He nodded. "Same for me. I'm not going to pretend the past 2 months haven't clarified things I should have understood on my own." I pulled a folder from my bag, placed it on the table between us. I said, "These are my terms. Non-negotiable. Take them or I proceed with collection on the full balance, and we communicate exclusively through attorneys." They read together. I watch their faces. "First, you pay me $40,000 from whatever you've been able to accumulate. I forgive the remaining $31,000. The debt ends there. Second, both of you attend family therapy for a minimum of 6 months, weekly, not for my benefit, for Sophie and Miles. Third, my estate plan remains as I've rewritten it. The bulk of my estate goes to medical research foundations and a trust for the grandchildren. You receive $50,000 combined. That is the cost of what happened. Fourth, you tell the truth to the family members who've heard various versions of this story. No social media. No public performance. Just honesty with the people who matter to you." Daniel read it twice. Karen read it 3 times. Daniel said, "And if we can't accept?" I said, "Then you lose the house, file bankruptcy, and rebuild from nothing. The choice is yours, and you have 48 hours. Karen's hand moved toward mine across the table. I let her touch it for a moment. Then I moved my hand back to my coffee cup. Not rejection, boundary. There was a difference, and I wanted her to understand it. Before I stood to leave, I asked them to show me recent photos of Sophie and Miles. They each pulled out their phone. The children were growing in the way children do, oblivious to adult failures, taller and more themselves. Miles had apparently improved his baseball form. Sophie had started playing piano. I said, "They deserve parents who value people, not assets. Think about that while you make your decision." 2 days later, Daniel called. His voice was steady in a way that sounded like it had cost him something to get steady. He said, "We accept all of it. Every term." Something in my chest that had been tight for 2 years loosened slightly. I told him Diane would handle the paperwork. I told him to get their therapist scheduled before the end of the week. He said, Dad, I know there's no path back to what we were. I know I can't undo it. But thank you for not finishing us when you could have. I looked out my library window at the Garden Oaks neighborhood in the morning light. My yard, my trees, my coffee going warm on the desk beside me. I said, I didn't do this to finish you, Daniel. I did it to teach you. Whether it took is something I'll find out over time. The family gathering happened at my cousin Gerald's house in Katy on a Saturday afternoon in late spring. 15 people. People who'd heard fragments and rumors and deserved the actual story. Daniel stood in Gerald's living room and told the truth. He spoke about the medical diagnosis and what he had and hadn't done with that information. He said he had asked his father to leave his home when his father needed support, and that he had allowed his wife to say things about his father that were cruel, and that he had chosen convenience over loyalty. His voice held steady through most of it. Karen followed. She told the room she had called her father-in-law an elderly, sick person who needed to be removed from her house. She said it plainly, without softening it. She said she had spent the subsequent months understanding what kind of person she had become, and that she was committed to becoming a different one. The room was quiet in the way rooms get when something real has been said in them. I stood, accepted their apology in front of the people who'd needed to witness it, told them that our relationship going forward would be different, built on honesty and appropriate distance, but that it could be built. Sophie and Miles were with a babysitter. I called them that evening from my library. Sophie answered. She said, Dad said you had a meeting today with the family. I said, We did. Things are getting sorted out, sweetheart. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Are you coming back? Not to their house, I said. But I'm not gone. I'm 10 minutes away and I have a yard with a lot of room for baseball practice. She passed the phone to Miles. He said, Grandpa Arthur, Mom said we can come over Saturday. Can we bring my glove? I looked around my library. The shelves were full now. The light came through the windows at an angle I'd grown used to and liked. My coffee was where I wanted it. My door opened when I chose. I said, Bring the glove. Your mechanics need work. The trust documentation was finalized the following month. $2 million accessible to Sophie and Miles when they turned 25. Separate accounts in their names. Daniel and Karen had no access to the funds and had signed documents acknowledging that clearly. It was the most important thing I'd done since selling the practice, maybe since building it. My Tuesdays and Thursdays I spent mentoring at a small business incubator downtown. Young physicians and healthcare entrepreneurs trying to build something, most of them making the same mistakes I'd made in my first 5 years. I gave them the information I'd had to learn expensively. They gave me a reason to get dressed at 7 in the morning. Saturday mornings were for the grandchildren. In the evenings I sat in my library and read, or I sat on my back porch and watched the neighborhood do what good neighborhoods do, quietly, reliably, without requiring anything particular from you. Diane called one evening in August. She told me the therapist working with Daniel and Karen had reported genuine progress. She said Karen had been the more committed participant, which surprised Diane and did not entirely surprise me. People who are precise about cruelty are often equally precise about repair once they've decided repair is necessary. She asked me if I had any regrets about how hard I'd been. I thought about this for a while before answering. I said, My son told me to find a senior living facility. He said it was for my health. His wife told him through a wall that she wanted the elderly sick person out before the end of the month. They accepted my money for 2 years without understanding what it meant or where it came from. I gave them consequences proportionate to their actions and a path back that they didn't offer me. Pause. I said, No, I don't have regrets. I set the phone down and looked at the 2 photographs on my desk. One was from Daniel's college graduation, the 3 of us outside the arena, Patricia's hand on my arm, Daniel squinting into the sun, so young that it was almost difficult to recognize him. The other was from last Saturday. Sophie and Miles in my backyard. Miles in his glove. Sophie holding a lemonade she'd made herself from a recipe she'd found online and was unreasonably proud of. Between the photographs were the trust documents. The past, the future, and the wall I'd built to keep them separate until the children were old enough to manage their own inheritance. I had built a medical practice from a single exam room and a second-hand X-ray machine. I had built an investment portfolio with the patience of a man who understood that compound interest requires only 2 things, time and discipline. I had built a life with Patricia that was worth grieving. I had been tested in a guest suite for 2 years and had my answer within the first 6 months, but had waited until the evidence was complete. The sick old man they wanted removed from their house had bought a house they couldn't afford to visit without his invitation. Justice doesn't require cruelty. It requires accuracy. You measure the harm precisely, apply the consequence proportionally, and leave a door open for the people who earn the right to walk back through it. Daniel and Karen were walking, slowly, with appropriate effort. Sophie and Miles didn't know any of the details yet. They were 9 and 6. They would learn in time. I would be the one to tell them, when they were ready, that their grandfather had spent 2 years learning who their parents really were, and that their parents had spent 2 very difficult months learning the same thing about themselves. For now, Miles needed to stop dropping his elbow on the follow-through. We had Saturdays for that. If you found value in this story, please like this video and subscribe to Real Revenge Stories. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What time is it where you are right now? Click the box on the right for the next story. Thank you for listening.